So the title has probably been sort of curious for a lot of folks, right? Judaism has eight genders, or does it? Um, and we'll see that there's a little bit of scholarship and a lot of um, popular interpretation, I think is the way that I'd put it, of some traditional Jewish sources to read um, some modern ideas about gender into older Jewish sources. And the question is that does that really work? So we'll take a look at some of the categories that people have suggested, and we'll take a look at, um, without going too deep into just reading text right off of a page, we'll look at what some of these sources have to say, because it's a potentially complicated issue and there's a lot at stake if you're worried about what do traditional Jewish texts say. For many of us, that's probably not really the issue so much as just, is this does this make any sense as a way of talking about traditional Jewish texts and things like that? Um, so what we'll do is we'll kind of quickly hit on the discussion that's happening out there. So what are we seeing in, um, I don't want to say popular media because a lot of it's not popular media, but material aimed at regular people. What's in academic and more formal texts? Um, that's all part of the discussion out there thing. And then we'll look at what some of these things actually say and talk about what's really going on underneath all of that. And, what are some of the takeaways? Um, so we'll start with just sort of the discussion out there. And the discussion out there takes a few different forms, but they all kind of read more or less the same way. Um, so myjewishlearning.com has an article, The Seven Genders in the Talmud, and says the Talmud, a huge authoritative compendium of Jewish legal traditions, contains in fact no less than seven gender designations. It's huge, yes. Is it authoritative? Okay, we could debate that about what the Talmud is doing. But this is an article saying that there are seven, at least seven gender designations. And then the other one is actually a New York Times op-ed called Ancient Judaism Recognized a Range of Genders. It's Time We Did Too, and is written by a trans rabbi who wrote there are four genders beyond male or female. So already the math doesn't work, right? One person's saying seven, one person is really saying six. There are four genders beyond male or female that appear in ancient Jewish holy texts hundreds of times. There is not an exact equivalence between those ancient categories and modern gender identities. So there are genders, but they're not modern genders. So what does that mean? And how does that square up to the other article? How does that square up to other sources? Right. This is these are two articles aimed at regular people, and they take a pretty blanket stand. These are genders. These categories that we're going to see in a couple of minutes, they take the stand that these are genders. So it's worth thinking about um, gender versus sex, and what does gender mean, and we'll kind of come back around to talking about that a little bit as well. But for all intents and purposes, you would read the New York Times, and if you knew nothing else, you would think traditional Jewish texts have at least six genders. Um, and they are not necessarily framed in the same way as, you sometimes hear people talking about two-spirit and things like that, and they're not framed that way either, because that's not doesn't tend to be how the rabbis talk about stuff. So the list of genders, if you go with the seven, is male and female, both male and female, which you'll kind of go with this and that. androgynous. Androgynous doesn't mean both male and female exactly, but it can. Somebody who has no secondary sexual characteristics at all. Somebody who is identified as female at birth and doesn't develop secondary characteristics at puberty. Somebody ID'd as a male at birth who doesn't develop secondary characteristics. And then somebody who's identified as male at birth without developing secondary characteristics because of castration. So castration was a thing. Um, we don't see that very much in Western society anymore, but we read a lot about people who are called eunuchs and things like that in biblical and ancient materials. So they are talking about, fundamentally, they're talking about eunuchs at the bottom, on the last of these points. So are these exactly genders? Is something that we'll look at, but there are at least these 7 categories. Um, and we'll see how some of that pans out because it's a little bit theoretical at times. In scholarly or formal literature, this shows up in a book called A Rainbow Thread, which that's what the cover looks like, um, which is an anthology of texts, really more than anything else. And the ancient texts really take up maybe the first 100 pages of a book that's several hundred pages long. And Noam Sienna, in this case, takes really seriously this idea and points to some of the different texts that kind of give you a sense for how the rabbis might have been talking about these categories. And then there are any number of siddurim, of prayer books that are connected to um, historically LGBTQ synagogues. Siddur Sha'ar Zahav is probably, if there is one that's very, very widely used, it might be that one. Um, Sha'ar Zahav is the primary remaining LGBTQ synagogue in San Francisco. Sha'ar Zahav means Golden Gate, hence Sha'ar Zahav as the name of the congregation and of their prayer book, because Golden Gate. Um, and these both deal with this a little bit, right? So Noam Sienna's book really does present a bunch of different texts so you can see how things are talked about. Siddur Sha'ar Zahav takes some of those ideas and wraps them into um, new blessings that are written for different points in life cycle events and different experiences that are more specific to queer folks. Um, but they're both building on that sort of there are numerous genders idea. Um, so it's worth taking a look at what they actually say so we can kind of assess what are these claims? What's actually going on? And I have Agadah versus Halacha here, so I know that not everybody retains definitions, particularly when things are in Hebrew. So what we're talking about is Agadah is non-legal material and Halacha is legal material. So Halacha literally kind of means walking, and the idea is it's how you make your way through life. So the major code of Jewish law, the Shulchan Aruch, is divided into 4 parts, and 1/4 of it is Orach Chaim, the way through life, right? So really reflecting the idea of walking. Um, Halacha is legal material, and legal material can look like a lot of different things. It can look like debates about law. It can be blanket statements about law. Um, so it's not just the rule is. It can contain considerable amount of material about debate. Agadah is kind of everything else. So the word Agadah means telling like a story, but it's all the other stuff. So poetry counts as Agadah, stories count as Agadah, Theological speculation counts as agadah. So there's this long section of the Talmud that really is about what happens in the Messianic age, and that's all really agadah more than anything else. So these discussions that implicate these categories that we've just seen characterized as genders falls into both agadah and halacha. We find examples in both. And we're not going to look at everything because it is true. There are hundreds of places where these terms come up, and you could go forever and ever and ever. We're not going to do that, but we're going to look at a few categories and talk about kind of what's going on here. How are these talked about? And so the ones that we're going to talk about are androgynous and tumtum. So androgynous is this one that is defined as having both male and female characteristics. Tumtum is defined as having no visible gender specific kinds of characteristics. And we'll talk about what that means because it turns out that tumtum there's no medical phenomenon that seems to match this, which isn't so unusual when you talk about material from the ancient period. Nobody knows what this actually would be, particularly when you get the real description of the category. It's unusual. Um, the idea of androgynous, which we would really translate as probably more like hermaphrodite or hermaphroditic, is a known thing, but the tumtum is not. Um, so that's a thing to keep in mind that they may not be talking about it. They're talking about a thing that they think is real, but they're talking about a thing that no one knows about in like the real world that we live in now. So it's curious. We'll leave it at that. And part of the reason we're looking at androgynous and tumtum and not all of the other categories is these two categories hit on all of the weirdness and ambiguity that comes along with trying to make these determinations within Jewish law, but they also, um, one is real and one is not, essentially. So there's a really theoretical legal discussion happening, and it's interesting to look at the theoretical stuff because it pushes the edges on what the law looks like. Um, that's kind of what happens in law school is you get all these theoretical questions in class and you keep getting asked them until you sort of embarrass yourself and they move on to the next person in class. That's how it works. I don't know what to tell you. That's the Socratic method in law school. Um, so talking about androgynous first, I mentioned hermaphroditic or hermaphrodite is probably the word that we would use. And the legal statement in the Mishnah, so this is a text from 200. The legal statement in the Mishnah says an androgynous is in some ways akin to men and is in some ways akin to women, and there are ways in which one is akin to men and women alike, and there are ways in which one is akin to neither men nor women. And the chapter starts giving examples. How are they like men? Certain forms of impurity can apply to the androgynous that are the same as the ones that apply to men. And these are specific kinds of secretions from the body, essentially. The androgynous can take a wife, but can't be a wife. Um, if a if someone gives birth to somebody who falls into this category of androgynous, the mother has to wait a specific amount of time before being able to become ritually pure again. And it is a longer period for men than for women. There's a longer stretch of time that people are considered, that mothers are considered impure. they can't be alone with women, right? So this is another functionally male thing. Men are not supposed to be alone with women who are not their spouses or children or parents. And they're responsible for all the commandments, which isn't 100% true, but what they're really talking about are um, commandments that are related to time, which women are not actually obligated for in some cases. So comparing them to women, they say, okay, so some forms of impurity also apply, and what they're talking about is menstrual impurity. If somebody who's androgynous menstruates, they also have menstrual impurity, just like a woman would in Jewish law. Can't be secluded with men. So they can't be alone with women, but they also can't be alone with men, which is sort of an interesting thing to think about, right? You can't have somebody who is a man and somebody who is androgynous together alone. They can't be secluded. There have to be more people around. Um, they are not part of the inheritance scheme for men that includes the eldest son inheriting a double share, which is called primogeniture, right? The first born son gets the largest inheritance. They are not eligible for that kind of inheritance. They are disqualified from eating most sacrifices, as most women are in Jewish law. They can't be a witness. So women are not viewed by Jewish law as being reliable witnesses. Therefore, women can't be witnesses at a trial or something like that. Can't sign ketubas as witnesses, all these other kinds of things. And there are some sexual offenses that are treated as if they were committed by a woman as opposed to by a man. There's different penalties for um, certain kinds of behavior, and so sometimes they're treated as women for those legal purposes. Sometimes they're treated like both men and women. So what they really mean to say is they're still human. So some of the stuff that basically applies to everybody also applies to them. They are entitled to legal protections and penalties for harming them are imposed, right? You can't murder somebody who's androgynous and like get away with it. They're a human, you don't do that. Um, the mother of an androgynous person still brings a sacrifice after they're born because it's still a child. Um, they can eat sacred foods outside of the temple sacrifices. So this is um, Passover and things like that. And general inheritance rules apply. So they can't inherit as the firstborn, but they can inherit the way other children would inherit. And then there are ways that they're treated as neither male nor female, and they're not treated as both. They can't transmit certain kinds of impurity. So they can be impure, but they can't always transmit every kind of impurity that other people can. They can't be sold as a Hebrew slave because there are different rules for selling men and women, and this person has traits of both. So you can't have the androgynous sold as a Hebrew slave, which really we're talking about indentured servitude, which actually is a problem because indentured servitude is how you fix debt in the ancient world. So the androgynous who accumulates debt cannot indenture themselves for a period of years in order to clear the debt. And they can't be assessed for purposes of value of human life in a vow. And this is very, there's no short way of wording what this actually is, which basically boils down to certain kinds of vows that are made for certain kinds of generally religious purposes where I promise to do X and I swear on the life of Y. You can't swear on the life of an androgynous. That's essentially what's going on here. And so there's a statement, Rabbi Meir said, an androgynous is a creation unto themselves, and the sages could not determine whether one is a man or a woman, but with a tumtum one can determine. So this was the other category. Sometimes a tumtum is a man, and sometimes one is a woman. So sort of keep that in the back of our minds that they are creating some kind of a distinction between people who have traits of both and people who have traits of neither. Except that people who have traits of neither might actually be able to have traits of one or the other. So think about how you figure that part out as we kind of move on from the legal stuff to something called the myth of the primal androgyne. So Hellenistic Greek literature has this idea that the first human was both male and female and was also neither. And this idea flows into rabbinic literature, particularly in this section where they're trying to puzzle out what it means in Genesis 1 when the Torah says God created male and female. So the text is he he created him. This is usually how it's translated. God created him male and female. He created them, which is weirdly redundant, right? Is it one or two? What was created? How was it created? Why would we suddenly shift from he created him to he created them, male and female? What's going on? And so we get interpretation of this, and one of them is at the time that HKBH is me shorthanding the Hebrew for the Holy One, blessed be He, Hakadosh Baruch Hu. That's just literally what it says. I'm shorthanding it. At the time that the first human was created, an androgynous was created, male and female, right? So that rabbi's take on it is the first human was hermaphroditic. Another rabbi comes along and says, when God created the first human, created them with two faces, made two backs, a back on one part and a back on the other, and then divided them in two. So that the first human on this telling is actually two people pasted together. And then they're split. So there's like a male side and a female side, and they're split. There's another version of this splitting where one half of this creature is actually a human and the other half is an animal, and that's supposed to give you source for other moral lessons and things like that. But we're kind of seeing that there's other literature that's not legal that's starting to pull in this category and talk about it as a real thing. And the question that we're going to have to come back around to is that a gender? Or what's actually going on? The tumtum, this is this other category that we'll look at. A tumtum cannot, by physical examination, have their sex determined because they have genitalia, but it's covered. We do not know what they're talking about. So medical science has no idea what this is. The rabbis seem to believe that this is real. They talk about somebody who skin covers this person's genitalia, and then when you do the surgery, it turns out that they're a man. So they seem to have thought something really happened, that this really existed, but no one's ever seen this in any recorded memory that anybody really knows. So we don't really know what's going on. But we do know that the rabbis think if you do that surgery, you can change the person's status to some degree, which maybe suggests that tumtum isn't a gender exactly, right? Because it's not a situation of the person moving from one gender presentation to another in quite the same way as we would imagine it today. This is like the rabbis saying, this person's actually X and we just don't know until we do the surgery and then we figure it out. Like the androgynous, some commandments apply and some don't. So the androgynous and the tumtum both have to wear tzitzit, right? The fringes each day, but they don't recite the blessing. So they have wearing fringes on a talit is a traditionally male obligation. You're also supposed to recite the blessing when you do that, but they don't recite the blessing. So there's this weird space where half the rule applies and half doesn't. Also, like the androgynous, some commandments don't apply. The tumtum, the androgynous, and women don't have to go to Jerusalem on the pilgrimage holidays. So Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot are holidays that in the Torah you're supposed to schlep to Jerusalem and participate in what's going on in Jerusalem, at least for a day. And these are people who don't have to because they are required to do some time-bound things, but not all the time-bound things. And it really is for all five of these other kind of non-binary categories that we've looked at. Each one of those has a different constellation of rules around them. So not everybody, for example, is told not to recite the blessing, but the androgynous and the tumtum are. You have to wear a talit, you can't recite the blessing. So we get these really complicated sets of rules because the rabbis are trying to figure out what to do with what, from their perspective, are edge cases in Jewish law, which I think is an important thing to kind of keep in mind when we're talking about gender, because I don't necessarily think gender is the right word for what's going on here. And then we have this story of Rabbi Ami teaching Abraham and Sarah were tumtum, so had no visible gender presentation. As it is said, look to the rock where you were hewn from and to the hole of the pit from which you were dug out, which, and then as it is written, look to your father Abraham and to Sarah that bore you, and you are 100% allowed at this point to go, I don't understand what the heck was happening. So if that's you, you can metaphorically raise your hand. I'm going to explain it because this is Midrash, and sometimes Midrash is weird. You're always working with some principles that the rabbis use to look at a text. And one of the principles that the rabbis use when they're looking at anything in the Bible is there's no such thing as redundancy. If you see a repetition, the repetition is there to teach you some additional thing. And there get to be a lot of these. How do we figure out what the repetition is when you get to biblical poetry, which is what most of the prophetic books are? So this is a text from Isaiah chapter 51. So this is a prophetic work. Prophecy is often written in poetry. It uses the language of poetry, and Hebrew poetry doesn't rhyme. The ends of verses don't rhyme with each other typically in the Bible. What instead happens is there's internal rhyme and then there's thematic parallelism, and it's often called chiastic parallelism. So verse 1 says, look to the rock and to the hole of the pit. Verse 2 says, look to your father Abraham and to Sarah. And so it's got parallel language in these verses, and the rabbis want to know, why do I have parallel language here? Which one am I supposed to be doing? Am I supposed to be looking at the rock, or am I supposed to be looking at Abraham? Am I supposed to be looking at this pit, or am I supposed to be looking at Sarah? Which one is it? And from their perspective, the answer is both. because the point of all of this is these two texts are trying to teach us that Abraham and Sarah were both tumtum. What is that? How does that even work? Because it's not obvious, right? It's not like the text here is saying they were genderless or their gender is tumtum. It doesn't say that at all. So what's happening here is this actually connects back up to the idea that you can figure out the actual physical sex of somebody who is a tumtum because look to the rock you are hewn from. We excavate Abraham. Abraham turns out to have male genitalia. You excavate Sarah, and Sarah turns out to have female genitalia. Um, it helps a little bit to understand that the word for female in Hebrew is nekeva, which means hole or opening. So they really are kind of saying, we know the relative genders or physical sex of Abraham and Sarah. There would be no need to talk about that here, except to teach us that that had to be disclosed, that they didn't start out looking their gender, is essentially what's going on, which is probably super confusing. And there's another person who says, well, actually, Sarah was an Elanite, this category of person who is female at birth but doesn't develop secondary traits. So it's wonky. So Kathy asks, is this widely accepted? It doesn't have to be, which is a really strange way of answering, right? So this is Agadah. Agadah is not legal material. So there's some amount of freedom if you're Orthodox anyway. There's some amount of freedom to say, eh, these rabbinic interpretations of this, maybe they're true, maybe they're not, maybe they're accurate, maybe they're not. It's more about process than product, right? That's kind of an approach to it. That said, if you walk into a yeshiva, there's a pretty good chance that when you hit one of these texts, the rabbi at the front of the room during your debriefing period, the shiur, there's a pretty good chance that the rabbi is actually going to say, no, no, the text is true. You figure out the contradictions. But there's a good chance that he's going to say, yeah, this is true, which is part of the craziness of taking some of these texts seriously, right? This is a thing that we are taking seriously for purposes of understanding a mindset, but not thinking that that's how actually how it all works. So Ami, I see you got your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment that I don't know if there is any connection to it, but in Hebrew slang, tumtum is a variation of metumtam, which means dumb. I don't know if it's in any way related.
Not that I saw, so I don't know. I can do a little bit more research on that, but no one has brought it up in any of the texts that I looked at. I mean, certainly the rabbis didn't talk about it, but it also didn't come up in the secondary literature, which is interesting. It just didn't happen, or I didn't come across it. There's not a huge amount on some of this stuff and thinking about it in terms of gender at any rate. There's material that thinks about it in other ways, but gender is not one of the more typical approaches until the last really 15 to 20 years, I think. Um, so before we move on, because I know that this thing that we just looked at doesn't make a ton of sense if you haven't spent a lot of time dealing with rabbinic texts. So I want to make sure I've answered questions about it because I know it's weird. Keeping in mind that I can't see your hand if it's raised because I'm just constraining the window to me. And Michael, go ahead.
Yeah, I mentioned in a note to you earlier, I'm taking this Talmud class, the Society for Humanist Judaism, and we just spent, uh, you couldn't believe how much time on the issue of doubled verbs. So if somebody uh, uses the same verb twice, which is simply a Hebrew trick for emphasizing something. In Hebrew, instead of saying something is very hot, you say it's hot, hot. It may not be literally true, but that's kind of the way it works, the way that verbs work. Emphasis is that, but then the rabbis, they go, oh, and they concoct all of these, just like here, all of these schemes to say, well, when it says he got up and he got up, the second time it must mean he really got down because it has to mean something different. And it's so bizarre. But this is their methodology. I think this is the rabbi. I think said this is really from the Akiva kind of way of looking at things. Rabbi Akiva, in particular, was very big on everything, every word, every crown on every letter, right, has to have a meaning. And so when it really has no meaning, it's just somebody wrote something, right? And then centuries later, these rabbis come along and say, oh, well, these people who wrote this, because they think God wrote it, everything has to have meaning. So if a verb is used twice, just for emphasis, well, the second time it either means the opposite or it means it has to just take on some meaning. So that's what we're looking at here.
Yeah. And what Michael is talking about with the verbs is biblical Hebrew in particular does this thing where it takes the infinitive form of the verb. So, the infinitive is to X, right? To walk, to guard, whatever. And it puts it alongside a conjugated out version of the verb. So an example that happens a few times is the phrase shamor tishmor. So shamor is to guard. And then you put right next to it tishmor, which is you shall guard. And it then becomes this more intense, you shall truly guard. Which is sometimes when you see things translated into English in biblical texts, you'll see you shall truly guard or you shall surely or whatever it is. And it's not that the word surely is there, it's that the verb is presented in this doubled way with an infinitive followed by a version of the verb that is usually followed by a version of the verb that is conjugated out and specific to person and time and all of that stuff. And it doesn't say surely, it just says guard guard, essentially. So that's what Michael's talking about. And yeah, the rabbis, there can't possibly be duplication. Duplication means something. It's not redundant. It's not just an expression. This means something. So, so it really is very characteristic of what the rabbis do, where repetition's not really just repetition. The repetition comes to teach you something. And a lot of Talmudic discussions are not actually about the law per se. They are about what is this biblical text doing? How do we know that the Shema is supposed to be recited at this particular time in the evening? And why does it say this here and this here and this here? And oh, well, that's there to teach you this and that's there to teach you that. This is a very common thing The first page of the Talmud is basically this kind of discussion about redundancy. So it's just kind of part and parcel of learning to read these texts, and it is strange. We don't read things this way, but we're working with a different set of assumptions and a different text, and we have different goals. They are trying to figure out every single jot and tittle in the Torah and what does it mean and how does it all work together. And we read a text and go, oh, that's just emphasis, right? Like it's just italics, except it's not to the rabbis. It takes time to figure out how to read these texts this way. It truly is. It's often a multiple year process for a lot of people, just in the nature of how this all works. So if we wanted to compare, like look at a good legal point that's comparable that we can wrap our hands around, because that's the other trick, right? Is if we're talking about the laws on vows, who knows about laws on vows? We don't do this with our regular life, but we know about the shofar being blown. So like we can look at shofar blowing rules and get a sense for what the rabbis are doing. So with the androgynous, they say androgynous has to hear the shofar blown during Rosh Hashanah. Almost everybody does. There are some exceptions, but almost everybody has to hear the shofar somehow. So does the tumtum. They both have to hear the shofar blown. There's a lot of law not on who has to hear the shofar, but on who can blow the shofar for other people. So not everybody owns a shofar, and not everyone knows how to blow it, and there are rules for how long and how many times. And so the androgynous can blow shofar and satisfy the obligation of another androgynous person to hear the shofar. They can't recite the blessing for blowing the shofar, right? This was like, yeah, you have to wear the fringes, but you can't say the blessing for fringes. They also can't blow the shofar for anyone who's not an androgynous. I don't have that on the slide, but that's another part of this rule. They can't blow the shofar for a woman. They can't blow the shofar for a man. They can't blow the shofar for a typical child. The androgynous can't blow the shofar for a tumtum either. Like androgynous can only blow the shofar for another androgynous person. That's how this rule works. For the tumtum, they have to hear it, but the tumtum can't blow shofar at all for somebody else. They can blow it for themselves, but they can't blow it for somebody else. Not for an androgynous, not for another tumtum, not for anybody. And because they can't blow the shofar, they don't recite the blessing for blowing the shofar either. So why the difference? Because physical examination changes the rule, essentially. If we physically examine this person, just look at their body, no additional surgery or anything like that. If we just look at their body, do they have traits of both? Or do they have traits of neither? If they have traits of both men and women, they can blow the shofar. If they don't have visible traits of either men or women, they can't. They can have the shofar blown for them, but they can't do it for somebody else. They can blow it for themselves, but not for somebody else. So they're struggling because these other categories outside of the traditional men and women, male and female categories, they're struggling because they aren't viewing them as normal. I think we should say this here. These are not normal people in the rabbinic view. There are similar restrictions for people who have certain kinds of cognitive deficits. There are similar restrictions to people who are mute. There are similar restrictions for people who are deaf. There are similar restrictions for people who are blind. There are a lot of things that change based on physical capacity and physical attributes. And this is another example of it. So I think we really should be putting a pin in it and saying, is this actually gender or are we talking about something else? So when we looked at Halacha and Agadah, when we looked at those sections with Halacha, the focus is like who needs to do what and what people need to do. When we talked about the androgynous in particular, you probably noticed androgynous are like men in this way. Androgynous are like women in this way. Androgynous are like both in this way. Androgynous are like neither in this way. It's not that they're going to say, oh, an androgynous is in the same level of recognition as male and female. It's resolving ambiguity in whatever way they've decided to resolve the ambiguity in specific legal situations, and it's different in every legal situation. And it's not, they don't view it as identity in the way that we look at gender as identity. And they certainly don't separate it from physical sex. That is not a thing that happens for them. With Agadah, the focus is exploring difficulties in the biblical text and talking about the androgynous or the tumtum is a gateway to resolving problems that the rabbis see with how the text is composed. So it's about these categories, but it's not really about these categories. The categories of people that they're talking about are ways of working out a different problem, which is there's repetition, or it seems like there's a contradiction in point A versus point B. This happens with the law a lot. What's going on here? So they're not exploring gender. They're not exploring identity. They're exploring biblical text and they're using specific things that they think are in their world as a way of exploring the text. So we're not, I think, really looking at gender in the way we understand it. They're trying to figure out what to do with a world where they believe that there's a binary and there are a bunch of ambiguities and they need to figure out how to slot the ambiguities in. Realistically, some of the ambiguities they're talking about, they see very rarely. So that's a whole other thing. They have a normative view of what you're supposed to look like. You're a man or you're a woman, that's it. You get born that way, you stay that way throughout your life. The tumtum is born that way too. It's just that it requires additional surgical work to reveal the person's true self, right? None of this is how we tend to talk about gender now. We might talk about physical sex in some of these ways, but we don't talk about gender this way. So they're not doing gender. They're not doing identity. They are classifying their world. That's really what they're doing, which is what law does, right? Law classifies the world. So much of the discussion that's actually happening here on the legal end of things, where what do they have to do, what do they not do, much of it is really answering the question of, do we treat them as men or women? And it matters for only actually really one category of rules. So in general, there are lots of specific differences, but in general, the rabbis think of the divide commandments up as positive or negative, and inside of those as time-bound or not time-bound. So negative commandments are the thou shalt nots, positive commandments are the thou shalts. Time-bound means there's a specific time. Maybe it's time of day, maybe it's time of year. There's a specific time when you have to do this thing. And non-time bound is this is just always applies. Doesn't matter when it happens, you have to do it. Women in Jewish law are not usually, there are exceptions, bound by the requirement to fulfill positive, the thou shalts, that relate to specific times. So in traditional Jewish law, men are required to pray 3 times a day. Women are not. And they're not because the 3 times a day is time bound. So is the mikveh not time bounded? This is a good, Kathy asks, is the mikveh not time bound? So the rabbis would say no, because it's not on a schedule. It's not on a calendar. It's related to a person's physical state rather than you have an appointment to keep, right? Um, so they don't view it that way. The big exception that comes up, like the most obvious exception to this time-bound positive commandment thing, are lighting candles for Shabbat and for certain holidays, because that is time-bound. Candles have to be lit by a particular time on Friday night. Otherwise, you've lit candles during Shabbat and now you have a problem in traditional Jewish legal world. So lighting Shabbat candles is a positive time-bound commandment that women have to fulfill if there's no one around to do it. Lighting the Hanukkah menorah, same deal. So there are some time-bound commandments that women are supposed to do, but by and large, women are not actually required to do those. So the question we're dealing with the androgynous and with the tumtum and all these other categories is not really. This is a separate gender with all its own requirements. It's almost really, in any given particular legal case, is this a man or a woman? That's the ambiguity they're trying to figure out. Not, oh, the androgynous is a gender. The tumtum is a gender. So we saw Elliot Kukla write, there are 6 genders. They don't exactly match up to genders, but they're genders. Well, are they? Are these genders? These don't strike me as being genders. These strike me as being individual legal cases that you've got to resolve ambiguities about, and you're trying to figure out whether you treat this person as a man or a woman. Because this is the one square that we're really talking about. Who does this stuff? Who's here? Who's here? Who's in the red circle? Women are in the red circle. Who else is in the red circle? And depending on different physical traits, you might or might not be if you don't cleanly fall into the male or female category. So I don't think these are really genders, and I think it's a problem when we start seeing texts aimed at general members of the public, like in a New York Times op-ed, saying there are 6 genders, and I don't know if this is a gender issue in the same way. It's not a modern gender idea for sure, but I don't think it's really a gender idea at all, as much as it is trying to figure out, for lack of a better way of putting it, trying to figure out who's a woman in this legal case. I think that's really what's going on. And then we saw that the other texts that are talking about trying to figure out what the Bible means, those are not really about the cases that are being talked about. It's really about using that case to pull some other thing out and solve a problem. The rabbis answer binary questions with binaries. I mean, that's what's going on. And so the answers are framed with reference to physical sex. Nature abhors a vacuum. The rabbis abhor gender ambiguity. I mean, that's like the best way that there is, I think, to put a frame on it is to say they're trying to solve a problem that comes out of a binary view of people. That's it. Is this gender? So, what is gender? Is gender fixed? Is it binary? Is it essential or performative? Rabbi Kukla notes not an exact equivalence between those ancient categories and modern gender identities, because they're ancient categories. They're not gender identities, I think, at all. And, you have the title of the thing that says gender. You have him writing that this is about gender, but then actually he writes it's not about gender. And that's a very, I, I don't think, I'm not sure that this was a good article to write, honestly. Um, and he certainly got some flack for it in some discussion forums online for sure. Um, the things that we associate with modern ideas about gender, that gender can shift, that gender is not binary, that gender is performative in a lot of ways, right? That gender is about what you do as opposed to what you are in some ways. None of that is true for the rabbis. They don't, there's no such thing as trans for the rabbis. You're born a particular way, you're either male or female, or you have something that makes you unusual and needs to be resolved on a case by case basis. And it tends to default to treatment as a female. It just does. Is it essential or performative? You can't change. From the rabbi's perspective, even the Tumtum, who surgery can reveal the person's sex organs, it's revealing who the person actually is. It's not changing who they are. So I don't think we're talking about gender in the way that we understand it. I think we're talking about physical traits that cause legal problems, which lots of things cause legal problems in the world. I don't think gender is a concept for them. Like these ancient texts, this is not a thing. They would be operating in the realm of physical sex determining everything, essentially. Everywhere else in the Jewish world, most of the liberal Jewish movements have, in some way, accepted the idea that physical sex and a person's gender are both separate from one another and are mutable to at least some degree. It depends on which version of the Jewish world you're in. Reconstructionist Judaism, to some degree, Reform Judaism are much more flexible on these ideas than is conservative Judaism, which got to this as a set of minority opinions. There's some other time where we can talk about how conservative Judaism does Jewish law. It's very strange. In the Orthodox world, there's not a lot of flexibility still, right? Because they're just building on top of the Talmud. So you may have heard of open orthodoxy, which is trying to be better about gender issues and about equality and things like that. But they can't even agree on ordaining cisgendered people who are gay, let alone people who are trans or are in some way gender nonconforming. But they just don't, really aren't dealing with it. Even as the head of the Open Orthodox Rabbinical School gives a speech saying that the Torah is for everybody, whether they're gay or straight, cis or trans. Like, he gives this speech that says the Torah is for everybody, and they wouldn't even ordain a gay cis male. They just wouldn't do it. So even the liberal version of the Orthodox world doesn't know what to do with this. Um, and it's only in the last 10 years that there's even been a trans member of the faculty at any Orthodox institution. So Joy Layden was a professor at Yeshiva University, Stern College for Women. She's still alive. Was a literature professor. She's retired from Yeshiva University because of health issues. She transitioned. She got tenure and filed a letter saying, I'm going to transition. This is who I am. And she was immediately put on leave and told to find a new job. And it was only when they were threatened with a lawsuit that they changed. And she retired relatively recently because of health things. And so now the culture at Yeshiva hasn't had to change really any. So this is kind of where we are in the Jewish world, which means that in Israel, where the chief rabbinate kind of makes a lot of the decisions about what happens, what does it mean to be Jewish, there's also no real recognition of any kind of stepping outside of the traditional binary that exists in rabbinic law. So, was this about gender? I really don't think any of this really was. So this is, I guess, a case study in, even if it shows up in the New York Times and it's penned by a rabbi, it's maybe worth being skeptical because the material doesn't really bear out the claim, I think, about gender. And that's something that is definitely worth discussion, but I don't think they managed to pull it off. And those articles are all still up. No one's pulled those articles, so I could be wrong. I just don't agree with what's going with the characterization, I think. So with that, I'm going to turn off the recording so that at least if you ask questions, it won't show up on YouTube, and therefore your face won't show up on YouTube either.